Everybody saw the video?
Yes.
I'm not sure I need this. Whatever. Everybody saw the video. So I'm happy that you did, just because the reason is it gives you a sense of what the boat looked like and what it was like on the river. There were some pictures there of the barge traffic and the ship traffic on the lower Mississippi. The last 300 miles is classified as a maritime space, as a sea lane. And at any one time you might have 10 or 12 barge tows, and we all live up here, so you know what these barge tows look like. But at the same time, as many as 10 what they call Panamax boats. So it's very hazardous, and the whole getting down the river and learning how to get down the river as someone who never even piloted a boat before was quite the trick. But by the time we got to New Orleans, we were sort of confident at it. Let me just explain how I came to this book and what my purpose is tonight in talking to you about it. Then I'm going to do a couple of short, just one short reading, and then go right to questions, because the other night at one of the talks, I was getting close to finishing, and the bookstore owner and the bookstore person said, I said, oh yes, please, your question. She goes, oh, can we go sign books now? So it was like, thank God, not too long. So I'll just make this quick. But what happened is, in 2010, I took a long covered wagon trip across the Oregon Trail. I didn't intentionally repeat the same book with this in mind, but with the Mississippi book in mind. And as you know, as you probably remember, I bought a team of mules from the Amish in Missouri, and I found a authentic 1880s covered wagon in Kansas. I mated them together near St. Joe, Missouri, which was one of the entrances to the trail, and took it across. And it was an authentic journey in the sense that I didn't have trucks following me with catered. You can go on a covered wagon trip. They even have a big 53-foot semi-trailer that they have showers on it. There's all kinds of bull. And my brother and I just set off and did it and learned the trail, and it was a wonderful experience. But one of the things that amazed me as I was crossing is that if you see in the west there, north and west of the Mississippi, on the plains beyond St. Louis, one of the things that amazed me was the number of serious rivers that the pioneers had to cross. It was very arduous. The Platte, the Sweetwater, the Blue, the Little Blue, the Snake, and so forth. And I was amazed that these pioneers could get across the rivers with their wagons and so forth. And finally, when I got into eastern Oregon and a little town called the Dalles, which is a beautiful town right along the Columbia River, and I read there in the local history room that this is where I get a lot of my information, that at the Dalles grew as a town with the covered wagon traffic. The pioneers, who by that time had wagons that were falling apart and wheels that were no good anymore, they would break their wagons apart and rebuild them into rafts and flatboats and sail the 200 or so miles that there was to the Pacific coast on those. And one of the lines in a local history that I read was, and most of the pioneers were able to do this because they were experienced farmers from the Midwest already, and they had a lot of background experience in building flatboats during the Great Flatboat Era. And I said, wow, if you've read my books, you know that I'm entitled to say this. I think I know more history than know more American history than most people, and I had never heard of this, flatboat era. So I read dozens and dozens of books, and I'll just give you this little background before I do a reading. But so what happened was this space here between Pittsburgh and New Orleans became the waterscape that I wanted to see. It became the place I wanted to see because this was the original frontier. The myths of American history, which I go on a little bit about in the book, but I don't have time for here, but basically most of us, what we've received from our history teachers and even our college professors has been inadequate. The dusty route across the plains that began after 1843 is promulgated as the frontier era. Okay? Frontier era began immediately after the Revolution along the Ohio and the Mississippi River drainages because there were tons of veterans, Continental Army veterans. My great-great-great-grands were among them, who knew that if we won against the British, all of these western lands would eventually become available. And that was effectuated by Thomas Jefferson in 1803 when we bought all of these lands for, I think it was from Napoleon, for about for about $3 million. 1843, what's the so-called pioneer era, covered wagons, mules, and everything. Approximately 500,000 Americans crossed to the west by that route. Between the Revolution and the Civil War, 3 million Americans went down the rivers on flatboats. There were two forms of travel. The first form of travel was just pioneers who wanted to go in the Kentucky country. Abraham Lincoln's family was typical. His grandfather had fought in the Revolution. They were in southern Virginia. The land was kind of burned out. The economy of the country was destroyed after the Revolution. And they migrated first to Kentucky, which was, at that point was a part of Virginia. Remember, this was Virginia. West Virginia was part of Virginia then, and so was Kentucky. So that he migrated, and several million other Americans, particularly with the aid of scripts for land from the government that they won as veterans. The second group of travelers on the rivers were flatboats. Okay, it started in. I described the first journey that we know about by Jacob Yoder, who was from Reading, Pennsylvania. It started with 40-foot flatboats. Someone would empty their farm, put all their cornmeal and wheat meal and everything in barrels, build a little cabin on top to protect them from the rain. Salt pork, dried apples, whatever was the product at that time, and lots of lumber. And it ended by the 1820s. There were several thousand 100-foot, what I call leviathans, traveling down the river with huge amounts of product. The shipping was a couple 100,000 pounds in 1802, and it was 200 million tons by the 1840s. This created America. This created the modern America we know today. It gave us a maritime culture. It taught us import-export. It filled the whole drainage with the population. It was very diverse, mixed, as you saw in the video. The roots music of 10 or 15 countries in Europe, plus Creole, plus the African-American slave culture, etc., and the Native American peoples, all mixed together in this marvelous polyglot thing that we now call American culture. So this was the beginning. This is how it all started. And I decided that with a book, what I should do. My mental health has not improved much since I did the Oregon Trail book, which is when I said, well, if I want to tell the story of the Oregon Trail, I'll just go across in a covered wagon. So now I said, well, I want to tell the story of the flatboat era. And I'll go across. You know what we can do is just go forward a couple of pictures. And here, that's good enough. This is the flatboat I built on a Tennessee farm with the help of a wonderful gentleman who still knew how to build flatboats. And this was the first day we had it on the water. We I wanted to trace Jacob Yoder's route, so I went all the way to Pittsburgh with it, but initially we tested it on the Cumberland River in Tennessee. And that's what we built. And I could go on and on and on about the importance of the flatboat era, how it encouraged what is called vernacular architecture, which is that there was no tradition of writing down and building from plans, just like you wouldn't write down and build a pole barn or a log cabin from plans. As the account said in the local history room in the Dales, Oregon, these were just skills passed down during the flatboat era, and everybody could build a flatboat in those days. And I can tell you, my brothers are particularly laughing that I actually did a carpentry project like this because I can't build much, and it wasn't that difficult. I'll just tell you two quick things, and then I'm going to go on to my reading so that we can keep it brief and everybody can ask questions. So, the big problem that I had to conquer along the rivers was fear, and that I was an amateur at this. I became skilled, but like many amateurs, I started off making the mistake of, well, there are experts out there are people out there, and they're going to give me good advice. You know, that's a big mistake. What happens along the Mississippi, not so much here, but further down, as you all know, is everybody has a brother or an uncle, long lost friend. They know people who work on the river. They work on the tugboats, work on the big, and it's a huge industry now. And by the way, I forgot to mention during the flatboat era with that map, there was 20,000 people a year worked on the river, left their farms up in Indiana and Illinois, built a flatboat and sailed it down. It was the largest single occupation in the country at the time. And it's astonishing to me that the historians have never felt appropriate to pass that on to us. There are reasons for that, but it gets kind of complicated. So fear. They've either lost a brother, an uncle, or nephew in a tugboat accident pushing the barges, or they've lost their home in these spectacular floods that attack the rivers, mainly south of St. Louis. And my own family lost their home in 1937 in the Great Susquehanna flood in Wilkes-Barre, my father's family. And my uncles were still talking like, they fought in the war, they left in the Depression and everything, but they always talked about the day they watched their house float away in a flood. So it has a great amount of impact on people, and it caroms through family life. So people said, and they live on the river, they've lived off the river, and they don't know how to swim, and they hardly ever go down there. But they said, well, you're going to hit that first boil on the Mississippi, and it's going to spin your boat around, and then you're going to lose consciousness because the boat's spinning around so fast. The boat's going to capsize and sink to the bottom, and then you and everything in the boat is going to be dragged along the bottom. And you better prepare your family because your body's going to be returned to hell, and you won't even have your underwear on. And I write in the book about how nervous my Brooks Brothers boxer shorts felt about this. But anyway, so fear was a big factor. We kept running into fear. And I'll just tell you one kind of story about this, and then I'll do a reading. A book that's this dense and has so much detail, it's very hard to convey in just a reading. But one of the big things is if you go back to the map for a second. As many of you know, the Ohio River drainage, southern Ohio, West Virginia, of course, southern Indiana, southern Illinois. It's a totally different group of population that's in the northern parts of those states. It's southern country by outlook, by accent, everything else. When you get into southern Indiana, you're trying to orient yourself because you think you're in Indiana, but you're not in Indiana anymore. You're in, Pennsylvania. And there was even a famous country singer who wrote, I miss my farm, Pennsylvania. So it's kind of, you're not allowed to think words like redneck. I'm not allowed to say that anymore, everybody's so sensitive about everything, but what the hell, it's redneck country. So. We got down there and we tie up at night on these beautiful little town landings or just to a tree opposite town or wherever, sometimes in town. And everyone around town would hear that there's this interesting wooden boat down on the water, and they'd come down. And a frequent visitor was the deputy sheriffs. The deputy sheriffs would come down. They always seem to have a white pickup. And it's not their police vehicle. It's not, what they're assigned to drive by. It's their private vehicle. They want to make sure, though, it's outfitted as if it was a police vehicle. There's lights on it and everything. So they came down. This happened 3 or 4 times, and they would come down and go, they'd sit on board, and, we'd give them a beer or something. We'd talk for a while. All right, so what kind of weapons are you guys carrying? And I go, well, we don't. And the look of concern of a really conservative, Trumperite deputy sheriff for us, the immense worry that he now had on his face was, you ain't y'all's traveling down this river without weapons? I was saying, no, we didn't think we needed it. I'll go back to my house. I mean, I got a couple extra Glocks. I'll just give them to you, And I said, well, why are you concerned? He said, look, you're going to go down there. You're going to be going through Cincinnati and Paducah and Cairo, Illinois. And them kids from them housing projects right there on the river, I'll tell you, that's what's there. They're going to come storming out of the ghettos. They're going to kill you, and they're going to burn your boat. I said, okay, well, we're willing to see what happens. Of course, we got to Paducah and Cincinnati and all these other places. The kids were the best in the world. Most of the time, they came down, and, hey, man, look at this thing. You guys pirates, what are you using for a toilet, The worst thing they ever wanted to do, they sold us a lot of fish. The kids along the river fish a lot, and they wanted to sell to us. And, they once in a while, I had a couple guys on board who appreciated it. They wanted to sell us pot, So, but no threat, nothing to worry about, greatest kids in the world. Then we get down to Baton Rouge, and we're parked on this beautiful gravel bed that they have right by the main bridge there. And the wealthy part of town is on the west side of the river, and the projects are on the east side of the river. And, these kids came over. They go down and they fish. They fish on the river. You can catch a lot of fish right in that area, and take it up to the highway and have a little sign on. They sell fish, and they pick a lot of bottles and cans up to try and get the deposit back. So these kids came over and they wanted to sell us fish. And we said, this would be fun. We'll have them on board. So there were 5 or 6 of them. They came on board. We cooked up. I got my grill going, and we cooked up with. Driftwood and everything. But we cooked up the fish. And, man, you guys can cook, man. And the kid goes after dinner, Now, what kind of heaters you carrying? And I'm the northern guy, white guy coming down the river, and I go, well, I mean, we're sailing our boat down the Mississippi River, and we don't think we need any heaters, This kid looks back at me, and he's got this look on his face like Chris Rock. Man, you are the dumbest white guy I've ever met. Heaters, ammunition, protection, guns. I mean, how are you protecting yourself? And we go, we don't think we need that. We're almost in New Orleans. We've been on the river 3.5 months. We're almost in New Orleans. We had no trouble. We don't need weapons. You are still the dumbest white guy I've ever met. And I go, well, why do you think we need weapons? And he goes, you're just one day's ride from here to Cajun country. And them Cajuns is going to come storming out of the swamps, kill you, and burn your boat. And I'm going, wow, this is really amazing. I mean, people down here agree on something. And it was just fascinating. Here are these 2 groups, totally bifurcated in American culture, totally different places. And their solution is, we're fearful, and so therefore we need guns. And it became fascinating below there on the river. is some beautiful stretches where there are sandbars on either side that go as long off to the horizon as the Cape Cod seashore, you know. And huge flocks of American white pelicans are taking off all the time. It's just beautiful and beautiful, and it prompts dreams and thoughts and whatever. And I realize it's not about guns. It's just not about guns. It's about fear. It's about how we have created a culture in this country, or some other people have created a culture, that engenders fear of other people instead of rational thought, rational response to things. So with that in mind, there were many other things that came along and happened, but and I'm going to try a different reading tonight. When you go on a book tour, I have a really funny one I could have read, but I'm going to read this one instead. And one of the beautiful aspects of writing this book and putting together the books I do is that I go out and I discover old monographs, old history, things like that aren't normally a part of textbooks or history books or whatever, and to give the book timbre and voice and tactility. I love to find these old folks, and there was this guy named Timothy Flint, who was a huge best-selling author in the 19th century, very big. He's as you often find when you read your history, immensely popular writers have just disappeared. Immensely popular songs just disappeared, and so Timothy Flint was one of them. He was a huge bestseller. He's a very interesting guy, and he became kind of the voice of the flatboat era. He grew up in Boston, North Shore Boston, near North Reading. Went to Harvard. Was a farmer's son, pretty modest origins, but he was a farmer's son. He went to Harvard, and like everybody else in those days, he got a degree in moral philosophy and theology. He didn't know what he wanted to do with his life, so he just said, I'll become a preacher. So he became what they call a supply minister for churches, which is a sort of a weekend substitute, and for maybe a minister who had retired or gone off somewhere and hadn't found a new one yet. And he was promptly earned himself a reputation as just about the worst preacher minister that New England had ever created. And in those days, there was an afternoon sermon. In addition to the morning service, there was an afternoon service, so preachers were expected to, ministers were expected to have two talks ready, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. On grounds of poor health, namely, it made him feel tired. Timothy Flint said, I'm not doing the afternoon thing, forget it. And he went from church to church. He got periodically fired. And, his sermons, sometimes if he didn't feel like preparing a sermon, he liked spending his time reading detective novels and stories and things like that, and conducting scientific experiments. And sometimes if he didn't feel like doing a sermon that week, he'd just read from a list of all the deaths, burials, and marriages in the parish that week. You know, that would be a sermon. You know. So anyway, in 1815, he decided he was going to go west and join the flatboat progression of thousands and thousands of flatboats going down the river every year. And as so often happened on the frontier, a misfit from back in New England rediscovered himself, reinvented himself, and became this huge success. Because when he got out, he kept screwing up. I mean, he had started a farm, and after the first weeds came on, he'd go, boy, I tell you, the farming's really not for me. Why do you have to take out all these weeds, So he began writing all these marvelous books, and if I could find the name, it's one of those recollections of the last 10 years, passed in occasional residences and journeying in the valley of the Mississippi, from Pittsburgh and the Missouri to the Gulf of Mexico, and from Florida to the Spanish frontier. And believe it or not, that was a bestseller. It was a huge bestseller in 1926. And this is this is a passage from my book about one thing that happened to the Flints. So in 1819, Flint decided to move on again. I think this time he's going from Arkansas back up to Missouri. And he had several kids at that point, and his wife was 8 months pregnant. And it was December, but typical of Timothy Flint, the quality of his life planning. They left anyway. And a big thunderstorm came up. They were parked on a sandbar at something called the Chickasaw Bluffs, which is just above Memphis. And huge thunderstorm came up. Mrs. Flint went into labor and was covered with blankets and everything. The children went out on the sandbar and covered themselves up with tarps and canvas in the middle of a thunderstorm. The thunderstorm was so violent it tore part of the roof of the flatboat off. And the baby was finally born and lived for only 2 days. It was just a very sickly child. And they placed her in a travel valise, kind of a little suitcase. And while the children were crying, and Timothy Flint was saying the proper prayers over the burial, they buried her in the sandbars below Chickasaw Bluff. About 15 years later, Micah Flint, who was one of the boys that had helped bury his baby sister, his infant sister, was traveling down the river on a steamboat. And he was carefully following where they were. When they got close to the Chickasaw Bluffs and he recognized it, he sort of stood up from everybody else that was up on that deck watching the scenery and just contemplated the scene and remembered what had happened to him about 10 years earlier. And he wrote what became one of the most famous poems in America. I was still reciting it when I was in school in the 1950s. It's not, they don't make totems say poetry anymore, unfortunately. So it's like his father's writing, Timothy Flint, who was a very popular poet in the 19th century, is forgotten. But the poem that he was inspired to write that day on passing, where 10 years earlier he had buried his sister while they were stalled on a flatboat in Mississippi. The poem was called Lines on Passing the Grave of My Sister. And I'm just going to read to you the first stanza and the final stanza. Here are the first and last stanzas of Micah Flint's Lines on Passing the Grave of My Sister. On yonder shore, now verdant with the depths of shade, beneath the white-armed sycamore, there is a little infant laid. Forgive this tear, a brother weeps. 'Tis there the faded floweret sleeps. She sleeps alone, but yearly is her grave turf dressed, and still the summer vines are thrown in annual wreath across her breast, and still the sighing autumn grieves and strews the hallowed spot with leaves. The joy of writing these books is to mix everything in, you know. My editor said, well, I never asked you to put any poetry in there. But there's 3 or 4 poems in this because they're inspired by the flatboat era to tell you. And this is what I wrote in the paragraph after that. It seemed amazing to me when I read about the Flints that the rocky wagon road over the Alleghenies, then the unpredictable rivers and the vagaries of a rough, unplanned frontier life, not to mention the demands of growing up in a crazy, unstable family, could produce such character, such stanzas, such expression. Micah Flint's lines on passing the grave of my sister delivers to us something important. From the rudiments of tragedy and suffering, the frontier so often produced brilliant flashes of beauty. So I'm going to stop there and ask for questions, because I know if these talks go on, the writers have to, everybody just loves what I write, And presenting in person is very, very different from writing a book. And they just go on and on and on. And I'm not going to name the famous names, but it's like, sorry, Philip Roth, you're boring, and everybody at Simon & Schuster keeps telling me, don't read from your book. Stand up there and, So I only did one short read. Anyway, I'd love questions before I sign books. Are we doing all right on time?
Doing great.
Okay.
Go
Please.
on, I'll stop you.
Please.
Is that an air conditioner on the top?
No, that is a chicken coop. That's a pretty good guess, though. It's a long story, but we originally built the flatboat because PBS was doing a film about George Caleb Bingham, who was a famous river painter, and during that period, he did some of the Jolly Boatman. He did some of the most famous paintings of the flatboat era. He was kind of the painter of, and we made this boat so that the people from PBS who were filming had a replica of what the boat looked like.
Oh, really?
And it had a chicken coop on top of it, as many flatboats did. And I actually built that up a little bit more and turned it into my driving console. And it was a great trip down the river because we navigated the boat and drove the boat from the top. And so you had an extra 10 feet. And it made a huge difference in terms of seeing the traffic and what for. But that's a good guess. I wish it was an air conditioner someplace. Yeah. Anyone else? Oh, please.
What did you use for navigation? Did you use radio? Did you use any electronics? Or?
I'm a fanatic navigator. If you read my books, I've had a fair amount of success navigating in all kinds of situations where you shouldn't even be navigating in the first place. But absolute fanatic we had one person driving the boat and one person navigating and following the map. So there's mile markers all along the rivers. And you have to know exactly where you are. Because if something happens up ahead, and there were a couple times that they did, I'd call on the radio and say, Doug, what's your position right now? Mile 204. All right, good.
Is that GPS?
Pardon me?
Is that GPS or is that just one of the markers?
The first fundament is contact navigation. That is the first. And I would teach my people, when I got somebody new on board, because crews kind of rotated. We had INAV, which is a navigation system for the rivers, which shows you the water line, your GPS position, blah, blah, blah. I found I could just turn on my cell phone and do the moving map display of GPS, and it would always tell us where we were. But my first obligation was, no, you have to have contact navigation. And if you know a lot about navigation, you're best off always having 2 or 3 sources. So where we were, looking through binoculars on the miles, and also you could always tell every bridge along the Ohio and the Mississippi on the reverse side of that map for that section of river has a diagram of the bridge. And you can't believe how different bridges are. There's no 2 bridges the same. So you see that diagram, you look at the bridge, okay, good, that's the Natchez Vidalia Bridge. And then, only then, would we follow on GPS. So to make it easier on people, I would, I'd say from now until noon, we're going to contact, navigate, only use the map and what we can see. And we have to be exact, we have to be, and then I said, after lunch, if you pass this test, but no, after lunch, I said, then we'll turn on the GPS. So that's what we did. The only difficulty was couple times when we ran into fog and stuff, and it was better not to run in the fog. Yeah. But the reason I love doing that is I'm also an airplane pilot, and it's amazing how many people are flying around there out there. The electronics fail on their airplane. They don't know what to do. Especially these kids now, they've learned to fly with what they call the glass cockpit. It's a computer screen up there, basically. If your electronics fail, what do you do? And they, you know, it's like I said to this kid, all right, switch it off. The electronics just failed, what do you do? He goes, I don't know. You know? So, and it's a beautiful, wonderful challenge. I love to navigate by dead reckoning and politics. So, but did you have a question? Yeah.
How big was your crew?
So, at times, when I'd lost my crew or something happened, somebody had to fly home quickly for a family event or whatever, a few times I piloted the boat all by myself all the way down. But I got good enough to tie up and everything. Tying up was the biggest thing because on the Mississippi especially, we were always in the current. There's no little coves to pull into. You're in the current. You've got to steer into the levee just perfectly, create just enough moment for somebody to jump off and tie up. And you've got to tie up in a hurry because that current is just 7 or 8 knots behind you. So we got to become pretty good. So, but normally I had 2 or 3 other people. A few times I had like as many as 5 or 6 because we met a kayaker on the river who quickly became just a gorgeous guy that we just loved, and we wanted to keep him on board. And you know, and my 3 best crew members was a fellow I met in Tennessee who was a old-time adventurer, mountain climber and stuff. He was very good. But beyond that, the 2 best crew members were Cynthia Lee and Deb Satterfield, who were both women. And I had a problem with this reenactor early on the trip, who said, "Oh, no, don't." You know, these reenactor types are like, "Don't bring any women on board." I said, "Why not? What They take forever to get going in the morning. They always want everything perfect, and they use too much water. You know, and this was, I got 5 sisters. Probably use more water than they did, but then the next morning this guy comes down, you know, and we're washing all the pots and pans, and my friend Danny's helping me. Danny, throw more water on. I don't think this is like the 10th gallon of water we put on this pot in front of this guy. He goes, "What, may I ask, are you doing?" "Oh, just getting in touch with my girl, you know." It varied, and I'd say the toughest thing was dealing with human nature. Getting down the river was pretty much you can do, but dealing with people, oh, forget it. All right, we're going to do one more if we've got one. Okay, please.
How did you think about and structure the writing of the book? Did you take notes every day?
Yes, I sat down every night and, you know, this is how you motivate yourself as a writer. You know? Okay. No drinking until you've taken your notes for tonight. So I would spend about 45 minutes, and I would try and remember everything from the day and get it. And that's why when you read the book, you'll see, you know, as I stared across the Chickasaw Bluffs or something like that. It's amazing if you record it at the time how accurately you can write about it afterward. If you don't record it and you just do it from memory. And the other thing I did was I moved to Tennessee to write the book so that it would be equidistant from all the different rivers that we went down. And I went back and visited, and there were some really great people we met along the way, but maybe we were just stopping there for water and a little fuel at lunch or something like that, and I didn't have a chance to really interview them as thoroughly as I wanted. So I went back, and I don't necessarily say that every time in the book. I'm not deceptive about it either, but taking notes and going back so that you really have it as if you had reported it as a reporter is a lot better than just winging it, you know. So, are we good? One more? Oh, please.
How did you recharge your electronic devices?
That's such a great question because every morning on a book tour, it's I go to breakfast. There's a couple sitting there having breakfast together. Yeah. That's what people worry about today. Well, how did you go to the bathroom? But we had we did bring along a Honda generator, which is very good. And you see, I'm not a reenactor. I'm not trying to go down there and be a purist. In fact, it's a different river. There's 20 lock and dam systems on the Ohio. It's basically a lake between dams now, and you couldn't drift if you wanted to. Plus, it would be too dangerous to drift because there's huge numbers of barges and tugs coming by every day. So we brought a little Honda generator along, and we could use that to charge things. But also, we'd stop at some little town, Brandenburg, Kentucky, or Natchez, or whatever, and all the local farmers and people would pull down in their pickups, and they go, "What do you need? What do you want?" And we'd say, "Well, if somebody can run us into gas, but the most important thing is, can we plug our cell phone into your, and then when the motor was running, which the motor essentially replaced the drift of the 19th century because the rivers are so different now. That was charging a long life cell, marine cell, that would keep charge overnight. So. All right, I guess I'm going to sign some books, right?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, you can look at the rest of the pictures.
Yeah.
I'll just go through slowly. That's we're parked somewhere in West Virginia. That's what it was like. It was just very dreamy, and the sun was on us, and some of us slept up top, and
Was that cedar? Or what kind of wood did you use?
poplar,
Oh, poplar.
wet poplar, green poplar, and you see it that it's already starting to separate, and but it didn't matter even when we got much further down the river, and the separation was pretty broad. The rain didn't come through or anything like that. So. This is a nice shot. This is on the Ohio also, but see, that's a big coal barge right next to us, and what this doesn't show is there's another couple over here, and I had to negotiate that close to traffic almost all the way down, and you see I'm talking, we could have a Marine Band radio, and I'm probably talking to that captain right there, and this situation I happen to remember was, the reason I was talking to that captain was, he saw us coming. He was way upriver, but he was moving down the river, and he was moving very fast at that point. And he called me and said, "If you just stay right where you are, I'll talk to the other boats and make sure everything's kosher." And it was. But being in barge traffic all the time, and they can't stop. They can't really control their direction much. And if you make a big mistake, you're going to get run over, and that might make a better book, but these are mooring cells, probably from up here. You guys see them around, but one of the big products on the river is still coal, even though coal is dying. All of the power plants now on the river that were fed by coal have been shut down. But those things there are called mooring cells, and that's where they tie heavy, and they're built in such a way that if the river rises during the winter, the barges can rise up. But negotiating these barges all the way up and down the river was quite a challenge, and this was interesting because I figured out this is the kind of thing you have to figure out. Nobody's there to tell you. So a loaded barge like that is drawing 9 feet of water. Okay. I drew a maximum of 2 feet, so because it's flat bottom craft, and I figured out, especially when there's a lot of traffic on the river, if I just took my path down the river right along there, and there were plenty of spots along the river where there were barge cells for a mile or two, I would have plenty of water beneath my boat. I could just hug that fleet of barges right there, be totally safe, almost on the shore. I'd never run aground, and the traffic would see me there, and and know I'm safe. And you know, the captains would come on, they go, "Ration liar?" And you go, "Yeah, I'm going to stay right here." "Yeah, good." And you had to be a translator. And then when you got into Cajun country down there. All right, sir, we'll watch out. This gives you a sense of how beautiful it was. This is still in the Ohio, but it was just, and I can't remember what city that is. It might be Steubenville, Ohio. I don't know, but it was just spectacularly beautiful. And the only thing about this picture that's a little bit different than the rest is for miles and miles and miles, days after days, it's all Shenandoah National Forest, Chickasaw National Forest, etc. And there's no habitation. There's no city up ahead. But this is what it looked like. One of the crew members got off, took this picture from a bridge, and then hitchhiked like 3 miles down the river and was waiting for us at the dock. That's how we got that picture. I wish I could remember the name of this town, but it's the town up from where Rosemary Clooney and George Clooney grew up. And this is called Fat Boy's Floating Restaurant. And we stopped there for lunch, and then the guy that runs Fat Boy said, it's a Tuesday night, we're not going to get a lot of traffic. People boat over to this restaurant. So Tuesday night, we're not going to get enough traffic tonight. So just stay parked where you are and use our bathroom all night and stuff like that. And I said, well, we were thinking of pushing down the river. He said, free gin and tonics if you stay. So we stayed there. Yeah. This is my crew. This is Cynthia Lee in the front and Deb Satterfield in the back. And if you notice, Cynthia was navigating at the time, and we had to know where we were every mile of the river. That's just another scene. I think that might be in Tiptonville. I can't remember this, but see a big bar. So I don't know what he was doing there. He must have stopped there for the night, and because normally I wouldn't be tied up in his way, but I think he stopped there for the night, and we might have even talked to the crew. But it was just spectacularly beautiful all the way down, just every night. Here's again, this is a scene, can't remember where, but this is a turn. This is a bend in the river. And the water here, as you can see, isn't very good. But these captains are really extraordinary. And you can see he's pushing his barges right around the shoals there. And what another old river rat who came down the boat one night taught me to do is, when you see a tugboat with a big string of barges like that going through, just follow where he went, and you'll be safe. This is Danny Cordula, who was like my first mate and chef and everything else. This is where we were on the top deck, and this must be, this is below Baton Rouge, and you see those big Panamexes, and there's many of them. Panamex means that it's just exactly the right length to fit through the Panama Canal. They just made the locks bigger in the canal, and you can see there's 3 of them there, and we had to negotiate around those guys for the last 200 miles, and it was kind of tricky because the river is, that's the picture of the Jolly Boatman by George Caleb Bingham. It's a famous painting. It's in I forget the name of the gallery in Washington, D.C. But you can see they're dancing on top of the air conditioning unit. So I think, are we done? Is that